Talking to the camera, which is always good for a few laughs. See, I'm way off. I gotta move over a little bit. Okay, here we are. We're halfway through the term, and it's time for the midterm exam. So what we're gonna do tonight is to kind of go through what we've done so far, give you an idea of what to expect on the exam. And if you have questions, we'll entertain those questions at the end of the half hour. And so let's begin. And we begin with, when is the exam? It begins Thursday of this week. It runs for 1 week. So it'll end a week from Thursday. So you have roughly 7 days. It's not open on Sunday, but it is open on Saturdays. So you'll have roughly 6 days to get in, take the exam. As I will emphasize throughout tonight, always check with their hours of operation. Know when they will be open so that you can time it accordingly. All right, where is it? The Social Science Testing Lab. That's the center building. Number is 456. And it is an objective, computer objective exam. There will be 50 questions, and they'll cover everything from the beginning of the term through the American comedy, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And the good news is that you are allowed one 3x5 note card in the testing center. That's their rules. So it's just a 3x5 card, one of them, that you can use to remind you of things that you really don't quite get. All the stuff that you know, you don't have to worry about it. But if you get confused about some things, like later on, you might get, some people get confused about aspect ratios and things like that, the note card can help you there. Okay, move. You can use, the question was both sides or one side. You can use both sides as far as I'm concerned. It's their limitation, their requirement is just one card. Okay, there is a study guide available. It is on Moodle at this point, so you can download that. It will kind of highlight what I'm talking about tonight, so it'll give you a pretty good idea of the things that you need to know. There's nothing, it's not a review sheet as such. It is pretty much a study guide which says the stuff that's on that sheet is going to be on the exam. So when you think about it, the stuff that's on there, that's the stuff you need to know because it will be asked of you on the exam. Okay, I want to remind you that you are responsible for the exam, not me. So you check the hours of operation and get there on time, get there with plenty of time to take the exam. Okay, there'll be no makeup exams unless, of course, you fall over for some reason and are in the hospital, all that kind of stuff, and then I have to give it to you. I might not want to, but I'm bound to give it to you. But if you just decide not to take it and then call me up later and say, hey, I didn't want to take the makeup or take the exam. Can I take a makeup exam? No. All right. And you laugh. I heard somebody laugh. I heard that. I'm not making that up. Okay? I'm not making that up. Okay. The exam will cover material in the classic Hollywood style through the romantic comedy. And specifically, let's take a look at what you should know. First, you should have a very good idea of the overview, what they call the overview of American movie industry, which is the big three: production, distribution, and exhibition. What that means simply is that at this time period that we are studying, the overview of the movie industry as it began, it involved three things. They made films, They distributed the films to their own theaters. That's essentially what it is. So you would have Paramount Pictures producing films that they distributed through Paramount Film Distributing Corporation to Paramount Theaters. Okay, if you've ever been in a town, a city that had a Paramount Theater, that was because Paramount owned it. Same with United Artists. The Stanley Warner Theaters were partially related to the Warner Brothers. MGM, it was Lowe's Theaters. They usually didn't call them MGM Theaters, but they were Lowe's, this sort of thing. Okay, and the bottom line there is the industry's use, again, this is an overview of the American movie industry. It is the industry's use of genre to minimize financial risk. This was something they caught on very quickly, that types of movies, the types of movies generated audiences. And the easy one for that, of course, is the Western, which we'll talk about. But people like to see those kinds of movies. There's people, you know, and we're all alike now. It's the same thing, audiences. You know, a person will say, hey, I like to see comic book movies like Iron Man 26, all right? That's what I want to see. I don't care about seeing those stupid Sleepless in Seattle stuff, okay? Whereas someone else will say, I don't want to see another comic book movie ever in my whole life, but I'll go see more Sleepless in Seattle type movies, more lovey-dovey stuff, more man meets woman and all that kind of stuff, okay? It hasn't changed. The genres still are there, and you have, when they're successful, you better believe that if one movie is successful, if one, and that's all it took, one comic book movie was successful, you're going to get a ton of them. And the quicker you get them out, the better, before people get tired of them. Okay, moving on. The history of the motion picture, the early projection technology, as well as the theory, the concept behind it, which is persistence of vision. That a series of still photographs moving in that film chain creates the illusion of movement. Silent film, it began roughly at 16 to 18 frames per second. That created the illusion of movement. When sound came along, they upped it to 24 frames per second, because that was good sound fidelity. It reproduced the best sound, but it's arbitrary, but essentially it was creating the best sound. Key innovations and the individuals that are involved in the history and development of the motion picture machinery recognize what they meant, what is a kinetoscope, the contributions of Edison and Dixon, and recognize what is meant by the Nickelodeon era, and the MPPC, which is the Motion Picture Patents Company, which existed roughly 1908 to 1915. That was Edison's company, in which if you wanted to make a movie, you had to license all that equipment from Edison. And the development of the movie palace, these beautiful theaters that sort of created its fantasy as well. Going to the movies has been all about a fantasy. You go to the movies and you're lost in this dream world. Movies take you places you've never been. There's this sort of thing. And then going to the movie palace was like stepping into that world. The famous theater, Grauman's Chinese Theater, that everybody's heard about, it's like an exotic Chinese palace. Okay, and classic narrative style, ways in which cinematic stories are told. They spent a lot of time on this, and so I think it's significant that we kind of review this so you have a good understanding. The first thing that they talked about, they called equilibrium and disruption. So what is that? Well, according to our book, it's these things. It's an initial state of affairs is introduced after which something occurs to disturb this equilibrium. It is rather self-explanatory. If you stop and think about all the movies, most of the movies that you've seen, they begin with equilibrium. They begin in a world in which everything is right, everything is fine, okay? But something happens to disrupt that. It disrupts the equilibrium. So subsequent events attempt to restore the original status quo, but this is repeatedly frustrated and order is recovered only at the end of the film. So again, we enter the movie, everything's fine. Something happens that disrupts that equilibrium. Then usually, it's someone who must come in and right it, return the equilibrium. And by the end of the movie, everything is put back together and we move on. All right? The second cinematic method by which cinematic stories are told is problem solving. Now, in problem solving, over the course of the narrative, characters struggle to achieve their goals or solve their problems. Obviously, something has happened to disrupt the equilibrium, so the hero must solve the problem. What happened? Identify the problem and then do something to correct it. They overcome those who stand in their way. Those who stand in their way are the villains. They triumph over adverse circumstances, often things that are put in their way by the villains, and then finally, and or transcend their own limitations. In many stories in which there is an emphasis on character, it is what happens to the character. The character has to somehow transcend his own limitations. He must do something to save the world, but he can't do it. He can't do it because of something that's inside his own character, but he meets that challenge and he is a changed person at the end of the movie. Okay, temporal and spatial limits. What are they? Okay, the temporal dimension is a specific deadline has to be met or a certain task has to be completed by a definite time. We only have 24 hours to save the world. Okay, there's this deadline has to be met or we're all doomed. Spatial dimension, characters moving toward precise destinations or geographical goals. Okay, those are the great treks, the great journeys. Stories that are set at point A and they must get to point B. And often we combine the two of temporal and spatial in the sense that we have to get from point A to point B in 24 hours or else. And then we follow that journey and all of the struggles involved in reaching that goal. The journey, obviously, that's our next step. The video series talks about the journey two ways. First, in the narrative itself. Characters move not only spatially, but they realize other non-spatial goals as well, such as making deadlines, solving mysteries, falling in love, discovering new worlds, and coming to terms with themselves and or their fellow travelers. All right, that's the journey. That's a classical narrative device anyway. It goes all the way back to a word that we use for somebody that goes on a journey, an odyssey. Okay? But they also add this. It's the audience's journey. Going to the movies is a journey itself. What we see on the screen is what we are doing at that very moment, looking for goals, participating in deadlines, and undertaking journeys. You know, it's going to the show. That's the jargon I used when I was little. I always went to the show. I always begged to go to the show. You know, my parents could always discipline me by saying, "You're not going to the show this week." Oh no, that's a fate worse than death. And, but it was going to the show. That was an experience that I cherished. And I'm old enough to remember the palace. That is, to remember those movie palaces and going to that movie palace and getting lost in all of its opulence of walking in. And it's like walking into this castle, because the motif was a castle. And you walked in and it was huge. It was wonderful. And then you sat in that theater, in that auditorium, and you heard music coming all around you. You didn't hear that anywhere else. They had the best stereo system in the world. And you had that huge screen in front of you with all the curtains, and then they got dramatic too. Going to the show was participating in the drama, because the music would fade. And it was a cue. Oh boy, it's going to start. And then the lights would slowly dim. And you go, oh boy. And where I went, they had two curtains. And they would, the curtains would part, and then they'd hit the logo, you know, the 20th Century Fox thing and all of that stuff, while a second curtain rose on the program. So you see, the theater itself got involved in the drama. So that was part of this thing about going to the show, that it's a journey, an audience's journey. Okay, and then finally they talked about Aristotle's traditional unities and how the movies don't bother with them. Segmentation is a process of structural analysis that breaks the film down into its basic narrative units. And making a film is essentially that as well. As you know, if you're involved in filmmaking, you understand that. Everything is broken down by scenes. We shoot the film according to scenes. In order to save money when we shoot scenes, we may shoot scenes 12, 26, 36, 55, 85, and 156 all in the same day, because it involves the same actors and it involves the same sets. Okay? That's not linear. And that's what makes, you know, an actor in a film role can't just develop his character like on stage and have it change throughout 2.5 hours. Excuse me. But no, he's got to know, like, boy, on scene 86, I'm a changed person. But I just got through playing it when I wasn't changed on scene 26, and now you want to shoot scene 86? I've got all this stuff in between that has me changing. But you have to know what you're doing. Okay. Dramatic unities. This is the Aristotle thing. Action, time, and space. And most films violate the traditional unities and lend themselves to segmentation. That's essentially what we just talked about. It's no longer exactly linear, although our narrative becomes linear, because we can see that, but we can also break them down by the shots, break them down by scenes. Okay, moving on. Classical film style, film techniques, and relationship to narrative. Understand what is meant by mise en scène. It's a French word that means putting on the scene. Okay, that is everything that you see within the frame. All right? When we talk about mise en scène, that is what you see, everything. What you see inside that frame. And so often we'll talk about some directors who are metteurs en scène. These are directors that really pay very close attention to what you see. And often you know what those types of directors, because you see a lot of clutter. They like to shoot through things. You'll see things in foreground, midground, and background. And they like to keep it that way, and they like to keep what they call the long take. Now, that's kind of strange in today's world, because we have such an emphasis on cutting, and that's mainly due to television. But we do have what they call the long take, which is turn the camera on and let's let the camera move, which is the next topic there. Let the camera move and let the actors move. It is movement techniques. We know that we can move the camera just on its axis. You know, you sit it on the tripod and you pan the camera this way, okay? Or we tilt the camera this way, or we can put the camera on a mobile device and move the camera. Okay, and as we move that camera, we can move it laterally, like this, or we can move in on the z-axis. And there is a qualitative difference. I kid you not. There is a qualitative difference between moving the camera itself on the z-axis into a close-up and a zoom shot. The zoom pulls. The camera moves in. Egad, oh my gosh, there's a zoom shot for you. Ha ha ha. Okay, and some directors do indeed like to use extreme close-ups on people. Others like to stay far away. Charlie Chaplin always said, the difference between a close shot and a long shot, very easy. A long shot is comedy. A close shot, tragedy. Lighting, the different kinds of lighting, you know, like, and three-point lighting. Be aware of three-point lighting. That's the basic lighting. It's when you have the fill light, you have a backlight. Those things, that's essentially it. All those combinations, when a director of photography works at setting this up, it's all combinations of the three-point lighting. And sound, understand about mics, mixing, scoring, continuity. That is, you don't have to understand all the technical stuff behind it, but recognize that mics are used, that they mix and they score, the continuity of sound. And I imagine a lot of you people are involved in film production or video production. You have to recognize what they call L-cuts, where you actually, you know, someone is speaking, but you cut on that and you hear the rest of their speech by looking at something else. Those things are involved. The shot and the scene, know the difference between the two. Know the difference. Know the difference. That a shot is turn the camera on, turn the camera off. The scene is the full dramatic unit. Okay, scene editing, between and within scenes, screen organization, linear, circular flashbacks, you know, multiple flashbacks like Citizen Kane. Cross-cutting, that was something developed in the early silent era because cross-cutting was simply showing multiple action that's going on simultaneously. You know, it's the woman tied to the railroad tracks, the train coming, the hero coming to the rescue, the villain trying to escape. 4 separate things, but they're all happening at the same time. But we can't show that happening all at the same time. So what we do is we cross-cut, which tells the audience, I know those are happening at the same time. Point of view editing and the 180-degree rule, that's mostly for production. Don't cross that line to maintain continuity. And I got to move on. The studio system, the Motion Picture Patents Company, we already mentioned that. That was Edison's company. If you wanted to make a movie, you had to license it from Edison. That's one reason why Hollywood exists. People didn't want to, they were making movies and they escaped Edison's thugs and they went 3,000 miles away where they couldn't find them. And the key players in the creation of the early studio system, Noah Fox, Lemley, Mayer, Goldwyn, Marcus Lowe. Strategies of control, what they call an oligopoly, which is that vertical integration. Vertical integration is that production, distribution, and exhibition. Blind booking versus block booking, runs, zones, clearances, you can look those up. The Sherman antitrust ruling against the MPCC in 1915, which more or less was the end of Edison's control. The 5 major studios were Paramount, MGM, Fox, Warner Brothers, and RKO. The 3 minors, Universal, Columbia, United Artists. The low-budget filmmakers that were known as Poverty Row, they were Republic, Monogram, Grand National, PRC, Eagle Lion, Allied Artists, and in the 1950s, American International. The Department of Justice Paramount case, 1958, a very important decision. said that the studios, you could not do the big three. You had to give up one of them. You could not produce them, distribute them, and show the films. You had to get rid of them. What did they get rid of? Theaters. Okay? And the effect of the breakup on current film production, that is something that we could spend a week on in a lecture class talking about that. The average cost of film production over time, which is unbelievable. Rise of film artisans and independent film producers. This essentially begins in the 1950s. And the old studios like Universal are now financiers and distributors of independently made films. Okay, the star. Stars have masks, personas created by film studios. The role of mass media and public in making and breaking stars. They're at the mercy of their public, and that's it. You know, you could have film critics out there that just can't stand that guy, so he always gets bad reviews. Okay, that can be a killer. Blacks and other minority stars, and their example is Sidney Poitier. The blaxploitation movies of the 70s, very strange movies. Since the breakup of the studio system, stars can make it via other media, for example, music and television. And often has been movie actors in the 1950s. Those who were losing their place in the movies ended up in TV series. Okay, genre, the ability to categorize movies. Genre serves to stabilize an otherwise unstable movie industry, and it does it by familiarity. Familiarity. I can never say that word. Okay, so there, you can just read it. It's one of those I get tongue-tied. Each new film banks on a number of familiar elements, motifs, and themes, but in a new way. It's the equivalent of, in music theory, of theme and variation. It's the same theme, same movie, same crime story, but it's done in a different way. And the beginnings of all of this found in the Western, which is distinctly American, based on dime novels and real-life characters, you know, Wild Bill Hickok and that sort of thing. The three essential ingredients: the hero, the villain, and the landscape. They made a big deal about the landscape, and it's true. That's why Westerns were a favorite of color. When the movies started to convert to color in the 40s and especially in the 1950s, Westerns were the preferred films for that. Also symbolism, East meets West, fact meets fiction, culture versus nature, culture, conflicts, okay, they talked about all of that, I'm not going to do it. Okay. The last Western, the final frontier, space films. Okay. Space films are essentially just Westerns set in another place. All right, American comedy. The comic expression of social repression, they talked about that. It was the themes of American comedy, which include racism, social integration, comic disintegration and disorder, and the containing chaos. They talked about that, and also what they talked about is class and democracy. Many of the great comedies were filmed in the 1930s during the Depression, and if you see those great comedies, it's usually very much a working class situation versus a high class. And it is disruption of the higher classes, all the way down to things like the Three Stooges, where they end up at a high society party and they turn the whole thing upside down by throwing pies and things at each other. Okay, popular comedy actors. The silent comedy was slapstick. I mean, it's visually oriented, obviously, and the two great ones, Chaplin and Keaton. In the early sound, it's verbal wit. Laurel and Hardy and the Marx Brothers, and I'm not going to go through all of that new stuff because hear the music. Remember all that stuff. The study guide's available, and it's online, it's on the net, it's positive, no makeup exams, and you're responsible, and what else? It's the end. All right, I made it. Any questions? Any questions for the good of the order? I still hear the music playing. Maybe it's going to play for 5 minutes. I thought we were moving out. Yes?
What is the composition of the test?
Yes, pretty much it'll be the multiple choice, yeah.